Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on.
Arch Rock, submitted by Mackie Cruiser. This is a fantastical tale from my time in Michigan. We used to go camping there all the time with my family, and we called it going up north. At the time, I lived outside of Saginaw, but every chance we got, we would go up north. Normally, I wouldn't share this story, but because it involved my family and not a bunch of drunken frat boys like so many other stories I hear on YouTube channels, including yours, I thought I would share. There's a place on Mackinac Island on Lake Huron that many Native Americans hold sacrosanct and believe it is a place of power. A lot of people go there to visit, and it is an amazing limestone arch with a gorgeous view. However, my story happens from the water, and not the roadways that most people take to get there. I suppose I already sound arrogant, and maybe that's correct, but I think I'm always vigilant about keeping things real the same way that others are about places they love. For anyone who doesn't know who's never been there, Arch Rock is part of the Mackinac Island State Park. It's really cool, and I highly suggest anyone listening to visit Michigan. Sometimes it gets a bad rap because of Detroit and all the ratty stuff from the automotive industry, but up north is some of the most beautiful landscape you'll ever see. Anyway, Mackinac Island was also the place where they shot the movie Somewhere in Time, which will always be one of my favorites. So, we happened to be doing some cruising and fishing on my father's boat. This was in 1991 or thereabouts. My father had a 26-foot cuddy cabin bayliner that we would go out on all the time, and on this particular occasion, we were planning on staying on the boat rather than on the island itself. We'd been on the island many times, but for whatever reason my father decided it was too expensive that year, so staying on the boat at night was his decision. It was just me, my sister, who I'll call Amy, and my parents on the boat, so it was cramped but still good family fun. I was 14 at the time, and my sister was 12. After cruising around and having a good day of swimming, we had to stop to have something to eat on the island, and we decided to wrap things up and anchor outside of Arch Rock. As I said, look it up. It's really cool, and we were just sitting on our boat enjoying the evening and could see a lot of people checking out the unique geological formation from the water. That night, after we had decided to bed down on the boat, I woke up needing to go to the bathroom. I got up and went out to the rear portion of the boat to pee over the side. Yeah, I know, it sounds gross, and we did have a portable toilet. But as a guy, this was a heck of a lot easier for him to just whip it out and pee over the side. As I was doing it, I heard a faint yell coming from the island. In the darkness, I looked over and could make out the arch, but of course couldn't really see anything. But I kept hearing this odd yell. After a few minutes, my dad came up from the cuddy cabin to see if I was okay, and I told him about the yell. We sat quietly and heard it again. Even in the darkness, I could see my dad looking at me with a shocked look on his face. This was not a yell for help, but it wasn't a happy thing either. It sounded like someone in distress, but again, not looking for help. I guess I'm being ambiguous with my description, but what I'm saying is that this was just someone yelling to yell. I asked my dad if we should call somebody on our ship-to-shore radio, and he said no, whoever that is probably just fooling around. My dad looked at his watch and said it was 1:30 in the morning and that we should go back to bed and not worry about it. We did, and I fell asleep quickly. But around 2:30, or maybe an hour or so later, I heard something tapping on the side of the boat. I was up against the wall in the cabin, but I heard the distinct sound of tapping. It wasn't waves, and it wasn't the lapping of the water. This was a steady tapping. Immediately I thought it had something to do with the rope in our anchor line and wanted to just go back to bed and not pay attention to it. But as much as I tried to go back to sleep, I couldn't ignore the sound of this tapping. Part of me wanted to wake up my dad and have him hear it as well, but I was also starting to get a little wigged out. So after an hour of hearing this tapping and no one else waking up, I decided to go back out for another pee even though I was scared. When I got into the night air and was ready to go, I looked over the side of the boat and saw a figure bobbing in the water, tapping on the side of the hull. It didn't look like a human being. It was, for lack of a better term, ghost-like, but still physical enough to tap on the side of the boat. I stood frozen staring at it, and after maybe 10 seconds, I saw this thing turn its head to look directly at me. Before I could do anything or call for my mom or dad, this thing opened its mouth and made this blood-curdling yell, the same yell we had heard coming from the arch earlier in the night. At this point, I screamed too, terrified, and the figure dropped into the water and didn't reappear. My mom and dad crawled out of the cuddy to see what was wrong, and I'm sure my stupid teenage babbling didn't get the story out properly. My dad said I was probably just dreaming and needed to go back to sleep. I got a drink of water, and my mom gave me a hug, and I was ready to go back to bed, when all three of us heard that same yell coming from Arch Rock. At this point, my dad got out his binoculars and looked at the stone formation, and just whispered the word, "Jesus." He said he had seen someone standing or walking on the arch with their hands on their mouth yelling. He said we needed to go back below and blew it off. And that's exactly what we did. I know this is anticlimactic, but we never figured out who was yelling in the middle of the night, or who it was that came up to our boat. At least I don't. Over the years, and as many times as I've told the story, my family actually now believes me. Sounds silly, but it was super scary at the time. We still talk about it, and no one has any explanation for whatever that thing was. What Was That? By Calico Jack. This is not a ghost story, nor is it scary in the traditional sense, but it's something I experienced one time that I couldn't explain, and I've wondered for a long time whether it may have been supernatural or cryptozoological in nature. This story contains no jump scares or humanoid figures, but it illustrates one of my favorite subjects of the unexplained, that mankind is said to know more about the surface of distant planets than we do about the deep ocean. And the ocean can be weird as shit. In the summer of 2006, I was studying abroad in England. We had a few days off and decided to take a trip to Amsterdam to do the things that American college students used to do in Amsterdam. This required an overnight ride on a massive cruise ferry called the Pride of Hull from Hull, England. We were going to Rotterdam, Netherlands. It was a big, beautiful ship, as nice as a cruise ship with restaurants, bars, lounges, private staterooms, etc. There were over 1,000 passengers and crew on board, and we left Hull in the late afternoon. It was a beautiful summer evening, strangely warm for the North Sea, but windy as hell. The sea was choppy and full of whitecaps glowing greenish in the light of the setting sun. My group was holed up at the bar and ordering drinks, and after 1 or 2 ales, I excused myself to go to the outside deck to smoke a cigarette. Now remember, we were going to Amsterdam, not from. I swear I was smoking nothing more than the good old harmless Marlboro tobacco. Anyway, I walked out onto the outer deck, and that's when I saw one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen. Off the port side, about even with the ship, there was a very heavy wake in the water, with no visible source at all. Yep, a classic Kelvin wake pattern, just randomly kicked up in the middle of the sea. I grew up in the Chesapeake region. I know how boats work. This looked like a large watercraft of some sort was underway a few hundred yards off our port. A large chevron-shaped wave pattern moved abreast of us at roughly the same speed. It was even kicking up a vortex of bubbles behind it. But not a thing was visible at the vortex that could explain its existence. Other people saw it too. I saw a few passengers point it out to others, and some officers were visible on the flying bridge with binoculars looking at it, but they were too far away for me to get a good look at their faces to discern any concern or apprehension. One appeared to be talking into a cell phone or a walkie-talkie. I watched it for about 10 minutes as it appeared to slow and fall back behind us, eventually disappearing on the horizon. The officers upstairs never took their binoculars off of it. At no point was I ever concerned. I was just mesmerized. Was it something under the surface? It was way too big and fast to be a whale. Some kind of submarine? It would be highly unprofessional and dangerous for a sub to get that close to a passenger ship with so many people on board. Was it some kind of natural phenomenon? A confluence of several waves? Maybe an underwater sea vent? To this day, I have never seen or heard of anything that even remotely resembles what I saw. The ocean holds more mysteries than I think we even realize. Pirate Attack, submitted by Lone Ranger 6. After I finished my service in the USN, I took a job as a contractor with a security group aboard a VLCC. I'm not going to name the name of the vessel, but this took place off the coast of Mogadishu in 2011. The tanker was about 1,200 feet in length, so you can imagine that's a lot of real estate to protect, and pirates are usually in smaller vessels that can outmatch the speed of such a lumbering thing as an oil tanker. The skip and his crew had taken a number of precautions against any unwanted boarding, such as lining more accessible deck rails with razor wire, but even that doesn't stop some of these people. At the time, the most dangerous area for pirate attacks was in the Gulf of Aden, but they also happened often farther out to sea. If you follow the news, you've certainly heard the tales of pirates taking ships and their crews hostage, sometimes with deaths involved. This particular skip had been part of an attack years earlier as part of a crew before signing on as a captain of this vessel. He was taking no chances on having that happen again and was very loyal to his crew. He hired my boss and mates to protect them on a run from Dubai to Port Elizabeth, South Africa. Immediately, before even leaving port as the ship was receiving her payload, my boss, and I'll simply call him Ace, had the 5 of our team stack sandbags at strategic points of the aft where we could be stationed with AR-15s and have some protection. We were hoping for the best, but were preparing for worst-case scenarios. I want to mention that many people wonder why 5 guys in a small powerboat would risk their lives jetting out into open waters. I mean, outside of bulk payload costs, crews and vessels themselves can and have been held for ransom. And obviously, VLCCs are not cheap in the least. But these pirates are pretty fearless and ruthless, if I may say so. I heard a lot of stories, and I'd seen the news, and I knew what I was getting into. We left the Gulf of Oman, went through the Arabian Sea, and started making our way skirting the coast of Africa, maybe 20 miles out. Things were going smoothly, but that's when our run-in started. A skiff carrying 6 men was spotted on the starboard side coming from land. Our team immediately went into action and stationed ourselves at our points that were all within earshot of one another. This was always key in keeping our comm tight and being able to effectively work together. Skip had things going around 20 knots or so, but this skiff was gaining on us quickly. I did my best to keep cool. I'd been in combat and this was nothing new, but it was still a rush, and the anticipation of what was going to happen in situations like this can get anyone's blood flowing. So we got a better look at these guys and could see that they were armed, but to our advantage, it was likely they had no idea where we were to protect things. When they got within 40 yards of the vessel, Ace gave the go-ahead to start firing and hopefully scare them off. It didn't work right away, and the skiff came right up to the starboard side looking for any access to board. Now, my partner next to me was firing down, so I had to move to a new position, and 2 more of our team are on my 3 and also firing down. These guys in the skiff were determined, and they didn't let up at first, but likely had no idea where our fire was coming from. After about 2 minutes of constant AR fire, they started to drift behind us when my partner yelled out, "There's another one coming!" Sure enough, a second skiff was making its way to us, but this time we didn't wait until they got closer. We started firing, and I'm not sure if they were in communication with the first skiff, but they didn't come much closer than 100 yards before realizing that this was not a ship to be fucked with. Both skiffs let up and disappeared to our aft and starboard sides not to return. Thank God the rest of the journey was quiet, with the skip very happy with our work, and we remained vigilant for the possibility of another attempt. I can't tell you how messed up it is to see someone doing this, and you can look into their eyes and see their determination. I remember the faces I saw were not fearful. They were not yelling, they were not freaking out, they were robots just doing a job. I know this doesn't sound scary to anybody, but if you were there, it was very terrifying in a way. I'd run into enemy fighters in the Middle East, and when shot or captured, they looked like you and me, regular people. These pirates didn't look like that at all. They looked cold-blooded. Anyway, I got out of that line of work and came back home. It's been a while since this happened, but I'll never forget it. I don't know if I killed any of those guys trying to attack the ship. I don't know if they all got home to their families safe. And in all actuality, I don't care. I did my job. I hope you can share this with your listeners. Thanks. Oh Damn by Finance Dude. My scariest moment on the water was on the Mississippi River. A friend and I were fishing on the main channel in a wing dam about a half mile from a dam. The water was high, but we were being careful. We decided to pull anchor and go upstream a little further, so we got out into the main channel, and his 25-horse Johnson flat out died. My friend furiously started cranking on it, but it just kept sputtering. The current was pulling us closer and closer towards the dam, and there were no other boats in sight. I was in the front and tried to figure out what to do, as my friend pulled the cover on the motor and was trying to get it started. I moved the electric trolling motor to the front of the boat, set it on high, and tried to slow our drift towards the dam. I took the oars we had and started rowing to slow our drift, and I should mention that we tried to drop the anchor, but the current was way too strong at this point and wouldn't hold. The bottom at this point was mud. We were about 50 yards from the "Oh God" wires the Corps of Engineers puts up that you can grab and hold onto as your boat goes over the dam, when the motor finally sputtered to life. My friend hit the gas, and we got out of the current and into a slow away from the dam and current. Terribly scary point on the water. If we had to grab onto those wires, who knows how long we would have had to hang there before someone came and got us. If we had missed those wires, yeah, we were goners. Something Strange Out There, submitted by Downrigger Dan. This is really messed up. And I know when people say they hate it when others say, this is true and it happened. Well, that pisses me off. Because this is true, and it did happen. My friend and I were fishing on Lake Ontario in the summer of 2011. We were doing our thing looking for lake trout and having a pretty good day. We'd been out a bunch that summer, but this August things were really killing it. The trout get bigger as the season goes on. We were enjoying our chatter, the sandwiches we made, and a few cold ones, but keeping it low-key as we had seen more than one CG official out on the water and had been stopped just 2 weeks prior for a routine check. As the day wore on, we decided to head in closer to the shore off of Oshawa, where there's a nature preserve. We were going to go and see if we could get some panfish for dinner. By now, the restrictions on eating lake fish were lifted, and it was safe to eat them. Growing up for me, this was not the case, as the fish population had been drastically affected by pesticides and other crap in the water. Anyway, we found a nice spot in about 25 feet of water. I threw the anchor over for the first time that day, and we got after things. We were fishing away and just chewing the fat when the boat kind of jerked in the water. It was so violent and out of nowhere, we both almost fell, my friend nearly into the water. We asked each other if we were okay, and then started looking around the water to figure out what the heck caused that. My friend checked the depth finder, and everything was cherry. He just said, "Rogue wave?" and we both laughed. We caught a few more fish, had another beer, and decided to head back as it was getting late. Before we could pull anchor, the boat jerked violently again, but this time, we were being pulled along out into deeper water. I grabbed the stool in the prow of the boat, and my friend crawled to get behind the wheel. Going for the anchor was pointless. The entire boat was being dragged away from shore at a pretty good clip. I yelled out, "What the hell?" And my friend said, "Look, over there," and he pointed. He was pointing behind my back and towards the front of the boat as I was looking at him. There was a cluster of flashing lights underwater about 50 meters away, and probably, 10 meters down. We immediately knew whatever it was the thing that was dragging us along. This lasted for about another 800 meters before the flashing lights dimmed and went down into the bluish-black water, and our boat slowed. After a minute, I grabbed the rope for the anchor and pulled it up as fast as I could, but noticed there was no tension on it. Why, you might ask? Only about half the line came back. It had been severed, and the anchor was no longer attached to it. I held up the rope to my friend, and he just shook his head. I said, "That was crazy, eh?" And he quickly fired up the motor and told me to get back to his seat. He pushed the throttle hard, and we sped away from there back to the boat launch where we had entered. We quietly got the boat out of the water and onto its trailer. I don't think we said more than 2 words during the entire process. We weren't that shaken up, but we just didn't know what to say. We skipped the fish that we caught and went to a restaurant for something to eat. And finally, my friend said, "What the hell was that?" I said, "I don't know, but I'll bet if we told anybody, they'd send us off to the loony bin pretty damn quick." It wasn't until a year later that I heard a radio show talking about USOs, unidentified submerged objects, and immediately I called my friend. I told him what I had heard, and he said that he had actually brought up the situation to a coworker of his that was into weird stuff, and that he had heard the same thing, and that reports of USOs outside of Toronto and along the coast of the lake were not uncommon. To be honest, I really don't care what it was. I'm just glad we weren't pulled under, or worse. Don't Mess with Mother Nature by Finally Retired. As a sailor, one time we had 3 races scheduled, but a front was also scheduled to come through sometime during a race. After 2 races, I saw a black squall line approaching in the distance. Deciding discretion is the better part of valor, we headed in. Of course, the rest of the fleet decided to remain racing. We were almost back to the marina when the squall hit. I don't know how high the winds got, but everything was blowing by horizontally, and it got very dark, except for the flashes of lightning. I told my crew to get down below and stay away from any metal parts, while I remained topside, handling the tiller and trying to beat against the oncoming wind and waves. At least, going into the wind, the waves were not high, but were getting topped off and mixing with the rain, so it was like steering into an open fire hydrant. I was too focused on the situation to worry about the flashes of lightning, but I did move away from the metal rail just as we took a hit on the mast. I saw a huge flash, then sparks jumped from the rail and hit me right in the butt. I expected to be fried, but I kept looking around and I seemed to be fine. Sometimes it's good to have a fat ass. Within a few minutes, the squall line blew over and we made it safely into the slip. Apparently, as I said, the lightning had struck the mast, come down the metal shrouds, and went to ground in the water from there. But enough static had built up that I caught a spark off the rail. After we got back, I heard the rest of the story. One of the boats still racing got hit, and blew a big hole in its fiberglass hull, sinking it. Fortunately, the crew was rescued. On land, it was a more tragic story. 2 people playing soccer in a field were struck by lightning and died. Lesson: don't mess with Mother Nature, man. When a storm's coming, head back in with enough margin to make it back well before the storm hits. How We Started Scuba Diving by Allison. As backpackers on a 12-month RTW aren't known for being cashed up, we certainly weren't at this time. 2 skinny, raggedy travelers arrived in Sydney after 3 months in India with barely enough money to get ourselves around the great southern land. My then boyfriend, now husband, is Australian, so we dutifully did the rounds of his relatives. His late grandfather was a lovely old bloke, and he gave us a large cash injection to pay for an operation on James's eyes. So, what did we do? We spent it on learning to scuba dive and going on live aboards. His eyes are okay. He can see. We chose to do our PADI on Magnetic Island because it was cheap. The Great Barrier Reef is a long way out from the Queensland coast, so if you're going to learn to scuba dive, you have to factor in additional fees for boats. On Magnetic Island, you can do it from the beach, so it's a good deal. The initial PADI is a 3-day course with classroom work, pool work, and finally beach dives. There was a medical which you also had to pay for, and a GP on the island did those, and people do fail the medical. You also have to be able to swim. That sounds obvious, but people do try to learn to scuba dive without being swimmers. It is tested. You have to swim a few lengths. There was one boy in our group who couldn't swim a length without fins, and somehow he still managed to get in. The course isn't that hard. The exam at the end is very straightforward. We did ours sitting under the palm trees on the beach, all very lovely. We immediately went on and did our advanced PADI course, another 2 days. And this is where I came unstuck. It's true, I was a scaredy cat. I never even managed to snorkel pre-PADI course. I'm not so much scared of water as the things that are in the water. That's right, sharks, and fish, and bits of seaweed used to freak me out. I blame all of this on watching Jaws at an early age. It's a brilliant movie, but it scared the crap out of me. I've even been known to freak out in swimming pools. I mean, a shark could sneak in through the secret James Bond tunnel, couldn't it? So, scuba diving was challenging for me. The pool work went well, and we were ready for our first beach dive. And that was when the magic happened. We saw a beautiful green turtle on our very first dive. James said I disappeared after it in a cloud of sand, whacking him in the face with my fins as I went. I love turtles, and I love being where they are. I was smitten. That's enough background, so on to the scary scuba diving story. Day 1 of our advanced PADI course, the morning after passing our exam, we went out to dive on the SS Yongala. It's a deep wreck dive in open water. It's what you might call challenging. Choppy seas and strong currents mean you have to get from the boat to the wreck by clinging to ropes. Divers descend a line to the bow of the sunken ship and make their way around the outside of the wreck, aiming to get back to the rope with enough air in their tanks to ascend safely. The Yongala is spectacular. There are turtles, sea snakes, fabulous soft coral, and clouds of fish so thick you can hardly see through them. We made our way to the stern, checking out the portholes along the vessel's 109-meter length as we went. At the stern, we stopped to do a check for nitrogen narcosis. I think I did okay on this, but maybe I was a bit narked. I don't know. As we turned towards the bow, I started to float. This is what happens when you use up your air. You get lighter and start going up. I should have been able to void my BCD, but as a brand new diver, I just wasn't experienced enough to do this properly. I couldn't swim down. I was at the back of the group, frantically twanging my tank banger to get James's attention. I could see him looking around for me, but he didn't look up. Nobody did. We were in over 25 meters of water, and I eventually lost sight of my group in the wreck. I gave up and floated to the surface. An ascent like that isn't good for you. I had no decompression stops, and I was worried about the bends. But still worse, I found myself bobbing about in fairly heavy swell in the open ocean, with no boat in sight. Talk about scary. There are tiger sharks out there, plenty of them. If they didn't get me, I was just going to float away and be lost forever. Luckily, there was a large buoy nearby, the sort of buoy that would scare me normally, but this time it was my lifeline. I finned towards it, hung on tightly, and waited. I'm still alive, you can probably tell. After a while, a tender from a very fancy boat passed by and saw me. Pure luck. They dropped me back at my boat in a teary mess, and an extremely worried James surfaced shortly afterwards. He'd actually run out of air in his panic to find me, and had to make his ascent on our instructor's air tank. So, that's my scary scuba diving story. The time I nearly died. I went straight back down and did a second dive, this time clinging to my instructor's hand the whole time. Learning to scuba dive clearly doesn't end the day you get your PADI. Did we witness murderers? Submitted by Slick Rick. This happened to me when I was 14 years old in 1998. My family had a place on a lake I'm not going to mention, and I'm going to change the names involved. It mainly involves me and my twin brother. I'll call him Tom, and my cousin, who was also 14, who I'll call Lou. We went to our place on the lake every weekend all summer long, and for 1 week with just our family, and another with my aunt, uncle, and cousin Lou. It was always a great time of fishing and water skiing and campfires. I look back fondly on all the times we were there. My parents owned a Four Winds powerboat, but we also had a 12-foot aluminum rowboat with an outboard motor on it. My brother and I used to use that a lot to go fishing, as my dad would never trust us with the Four Winds. And I don't blame him. I'm pretty sure we would have messed that up real good if given the chance. So, that year, we were all talking about how we wanted to get up early and go fishing without our parents, just the three of us kids. We told our parents of our plan, and they were fine with it as long as we had our life jackets and safety gear. I need to say that this is not a huge lake, and is populated mostly with summer people, although there were a few cabins or houses that were full-time residences. It is, in fact, a very secluded and wooded area, and there is only one road to get to the lake, and it runs all the way around it. What I'm getting at is, if you don't have a place there or are not going to fish or whatever, you really wouldn't choose this lake for any activities. So, the night before, we planned out our game plan. We were going to sleep on the floor of the cabin's living room so we didn't have to walk down the creaky steps from where our bedroom was in the loft and wake up the entire house. We set a time for 4:30 and planned to just make some eggs and coffee and be on our way. Lou had also brought some really cheap Dutch Master cigars that we were going to smoke out there, acting like we were much older than we were. I suppose that doesn't add anything to the story, but I remember that being a big deal at the time. We woke up, had our quick breakfast, and made our way down to the water where our boats were. We got all of our gear into the rowboat and made our way out into the lake with our lights on in the darkness of the morning. The water was a sheet of glass, and it was dead silent outside of the hum of our outboard motor. We got about 100 or so yards off the shoreline and made our way down to a bay, maybe about a half-mile away from our place. It was a fairly shallow bay with a lot of weeds at the shoreline, and there were no cabins or houses there. Once we got to the spot we wanted and used a spotlight and our flashlights to determine where we were, my brother Tom cut the engine, and I quietly dropped anchor and let out some slack until it caught on the bottom. When we knew we weren't drifting, we got out our rods and reels and started to fish. Surprisingly, the fishing really was no different than at any other time of day, but we were still having fun. I'm not sure why fishermen think that they have to get up at the ass crack of dawn to catch the big ones, but I suppose it does make a difference for some types of fish. For the bass and panfish we were going for, it really did, because I've caught all of those types at all different times of the day. About a half hour later, and it was now around 5:30, it was still dark, but we could see light starting to penetrate the skies over the trees. That's when we heard some rustling at the edge of the lake on the other side of the weed bed. My brother Tom whispered, "Deer," and we all looked towards the shore to see if it was indeed a deer. During this whole time of fishing, while we were smoking our cheap cigars, we weren't really talking that much. I guess that's another myth of having to be dead silent to fish. But while we were looking and scanning the shoreline in the dim light, we didn't see any deer, but we could still hear a rustling of the trees and shrubs. Things got quiet, and then we heard low voices coming across the water towards us. We couldn't make out who was saying what, but we could tell there were at least 2 men on the shore. We remained silent, looking at the one spot, and that's when we saw 2 adult men carrying what looked like a blue tarp. They got to the edge of the water, the weeds, and the land. They murmured something to each other and started to swing the tarp back and forth, and finally let it go. It splashed into the water and floated there for a while. Again, we didn't say anything, but about a minute later, as the blue tarp started to go under the water, one of the guys must have seen us because he yelled out, "Hey, what are you doing out there?" As I recollect on this, I think to myself, what a stupid thing to say. What the heck did he think we were doing out there? 3 kids in a boat with fishing rods is pretty self-explanatory. Well, these guys, we now saw that there were 3 of them, started to yell at us and told us that we had to get out of there, and if we didn't, we'd be in trouble. As smart-ass 14-year-olds, all we said back was, "Yeah, what are you going to do about it?" Or, "It's a free country," and "You don't own the lake," and finally a very loud, "Fuck you," from my brother Tom. This made these guys really pissed, and that's when we saw in the very dim light one of the guys raise up a rifle and point it right at us. At that point, one of the guys said, "Move along. Get out of here now." They were not kidding. We realized we were in over our heads, and even though there was no way they could come out into the water to get us, having a gun pointed at you makes you a very, very different person, and all of our brave, smart-ass remarks left us. I pulled up the anchor as fast as I could, and Tom started the outboard motor. We made a huge spraying arc of water, and we got the hell out of there and made our way back to the cabin. We were shaking with nervousness as we docked our boat and left our gear in it and ran up to our place. My dad and uncle were up having coffee and a cigarette at our kitchen table, and we burst in and told them what had just happened. Both of them told us to calm down and slow down and repeat exactly what we had seen. My brother took the lead and told the whole story, with Lou and I just nodding or saying, "Yeah, that's what happened." My dad and uncle told us to stay there and went down to the water and got into the boat and went down to the bay where we said we had seen what we had seen. They were gone for about 20 minutes or so, and we heard them pull up to the dock, so all 3 of us ran down to the water to meet them. We asked them what happened, and they said they didn't see anything. They said they didn't see any blue tarp, and there were no men on the shoreline. I'll say this about that. They never accused us of making something up or told us we didn't see what we had seen, but they just told us that there was nothing there when they went down. So we all went back into the house for some breakfast as my mom and aunt had woken up and were puttering around in the kitchen making some food. We didn't have a TV at the cabin, but we did have a radio that was always tuned to the local public radio station. And this comes into play in just a second. We told my mom and aunt we really didn't catch any fish, and we told them about the weird thing that happened and the guy who pointed a gun at us. They both looked at my dad and uncle, and they shook their heads and said, "We went down there and checked it out. There's nothing there." My mom said that they should still call the police just in case. My dad nodded and called the local sheriff and let him know what we had seen, and the sheriff said he would look into it. And that was it. We just got on with our day with plans to go water skiing and having lunch out on the powerboat. The next day at breakfast, we were all just sitting around having pancakes and good old-fashioned camp food when a news story came on the public radio station. A young woman had gone missing from a town about 15 miles away. She'd been missing for 4 days after leaving her shift at some Greasy Spoon diner, and the police and her family were desperately looking for her. Tom, Lou, and I looked at each other, and I know we were all thinking the same thing. What if, in that tarp we saw, was the girl? I voiced my concern aloud to everyone at the table, and everyone stopped eating to look at me. My dad immediately got up and called the sheriff again and told him what I had been thinking. Long story short, the police came out to check the entire bay, but didn't find any blue tarp or body anywhere. They even sent out launches to check the rest of the lake in case something might have drifted out of the bay, but they didn't find anything. They did, however, find footprints of 3 men in the mud down at the edge of the water. As I mentioned, there are no cabins or houses down at that bay, and no real reason to be there. So at least that portion of our story was confirmed. As far as I know, the girl was never found, and no one has ever been caught or charged for her disappearance. But we all know what we saw, and although we can't prove it, we are convinced that we saw 3 men try to dispose of a body, but their plan was foiled by 3 kids in a boat, and their plan must have quickly changed right there and then. I am convinced of that, and there's no way anyone will make me change my mind, despite the fact that I can't prove it. It's a strange world we live in, to think that we witnessed quite possibly 3 murder suspects trying to get rid of evidence, and even when we reported it, it was too late, and someone probably got away with murder. I have to say it's a terrifying thought. It still bothers me to this day.
Creature in the Lake, submitted by Taskmaster. You wanted a fishing story, so here's one. My dad used to take me to this lake in Florida to fish every summer. It was one of those places that basically only caters to fishermen, but it did have a pool and a little store for families and whatnot. Anyway, we went out there for a weekend, and he was the kind of guy that insisted on going out at like 4 in the morning. I know that's a popular thing with fishers, but I don't know if there's any science behind that theory. Out we go in our 10-foot aluminum boat with my dad at the engine, and we're zipping along the shoreline in about 10 feet of water when suddenly we slammed into something. We hit it so hard I thought I was going to fly out of the boat. My dad cut the engine and shone his big flashlight around, but we didn't see anything. We were looking for logs or something else that was floating in the water. Suddenly, off to our right, about 5 feet away, I saw a shape come up from the water. My dad put the light on it, and I almost crapped myself. It was a head covered in thick hair. For a second, I thought we had hit a swimmer. But then this thing moved into shallower water, maybe 6 feet deep, and it was a thing covered in hair. It turned to look at us, and I swear it had these glowing eyes, but maybe that was just the flashlight. But it was huge. I have it burned into my head. It must have been 7 or 8 feet tall, and it looked like a gorilla man. It stared at us for a few seconds before turning and splashing its way to the shoreline, where it grabbed onto a tree branch and hoisted itself up. It stayed standing there for a couple of minutes, scratching at its back, and we just kept staring, not saying a word. I think we hit its back with the boat, and maybe it was checking to see if it was hurt. After a bit, it kind of just smashed its way through the trees and weeds, kicking up a ton of noise. I looked back at my dad, and all he said was, "Well, that was something, huh?" We never told anybody about what we had seen, but we talked about it when no one else was around, until the day he finally passed away. It was actually one of the last things we spoke about. Dad was right. That sure was something. Canoe Mishap by Cool Change. Floating down various rivers of the Missouri Ozarks in a canoe with a few friends and a lot of beer figured very prominently in my mid and late teens and throughout my 20s. It was on one of these rivers that I came very close to dying. Late in the afternoon, which meant many beers into the day, I decided it was time for me to swim. We were floating over a deep, clear hole, so I stood up in the canoe and dove into the water, much to the surprise of my canoe partner. The water was crystal clear and so cool, and I was swimming along about 8 to 10 feet underwater, really enjoying myself, until my chest started burning for a lack of air. I swam to the surface, and as I broke it, I took another deep breath, and I got a brief glimpse of a canoe paddling hard down the river. The next thing I knew, I was on the riverbank with a couple of people standing around me. Apparently, I had surfaced right in front of a canoe that was paddling hard to get off the river because they were ready to be done for the day. That canoe and I had collided, and it knocked me out cold. As I sank below the water and the canoe passed over me, the guy in the back reached down and grabbed my hair to pull me back up, and then they towed me to the riverbank behind their canoe. I never was able to piece together how long I was unconscious, but it was definitely long enough for a crowd to gather. I have no idea how I lived through my indestructible years. What's that line about God protecting drunks and fools? I guess that's what it was. Whitewater Nightmare, submitted by Finance Dude. This was when I was a 20-something stupid, afraid-of-nothing guy and went with a group of friends to raft Thompson's Canyon in Colorado. Back then the industry wasn't well regulated, and they would take anyone out almost any time, including this time, which was an early summer day after a heavy snow year, so the river was running extremely high and fast. None of us had ever set foot inside a raft before. They offered a trip where you could just sit and let a pro paddle, but that wasn't for us. We took the trip where we each had to paddle, particularly since the guide riding the back of our raft turned out to be another 20-something in a very small bikini. Oh man, the memories of her. But that's another story. We started paddling following her commands, one right, two left, etc., meaning the number of paddle strokes to the left or the right. We did great in the calm water, though half of us were horny guys looking to the back to see our guide. Then the rapids began, small at first, then bigger and bigger. I mean, so big that we were actually looking at the rapids instead of the guide at this point. The commands came faster and faster. One right, one left, two left, 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 left! The raft was really moving up and down, side to side in those rapids, with water splashing all over the place. The water temp was probably in the 40s, though we were working too hard to notice the cold. We eventually reached the big one. I forget what it was called, but it had some nasty name. The biggest water hole in the river. As we neared it, the guide yelled louder and louder, and by then we were like robots following her commands as the hole got closer and closer. Two right, one left! And then nothing. I looked back and no guide. She had flipped out of the raft and was floating along about 4 boat lengths behind us. That's when we panicked. We each had our ideas about how to get through this hole. Those who thought we should paddle right paddled right, and those who thought we should paddle left paddled left. We were about evenly divided, so we went down the middle and right into that hole, where we all did sort of a backflip as the raft went into the hole, got sucked into it, flipped back and started a sort of washing machine motion. In fact, we all did, except for the guide who I saw shooting past the hole and down the river. At least we had our life jackets on, but we were getting sucked in and out of the cold water, and what a strong current and undertow there was. The raft somehow managed to pop out of the hole, and so did 2 or 3 other guys, but 3 or 4 of us were stuck in the washing machine for what seemed like forever, though it was probably less than a minute. I managed to grab one guy for a while, then lost him, and someone grabbed me but lost me, and then we started going around and around, up and down, over and over. I saw some rocks that we wedged ourselves into and freed ourselves a little bit by a little bit. We finally managed to get out of the hole and began floating down the river. We swam to the bank as we floated and eventually came to slow-moving water, and we all made it out safely, even the raft. It was then we realized just how cold it was. We were shivering and going hypothermic, so we went and gathered some wood from the banks, and with the help of a kid on the raft, we started a fire and got warm. We stayed around that fire for about an hour before we got warm enough to get back in the raft, go down to the pullout, and finally feel safe. That was one close call, but thinking back about it, man, what a rush. Maybe it was that guide that made it all worthwhile. Monster after the storm. On a 41-foot sailboat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay with about 7 other guys, was doing a shakedown test cruise, planned out to be for about 12 hours. This was in the mid-1980s. Not as reliable weather prediction resources were there, so we did get caught in a tropical storm, with winds gusting into the 50-mile-an-hour range. It was just short of a weak hurricane. We had just barely rigged storm hawsers and storm sails because the fellow on board who was our best sailor sensed the storm was almost on us, and otherwise we would have died. During the storm itself, I expected to die at any time. In fact, we made a sécurité call on the radio. If you have time at sea, you'll know what I'm talking about, but if not, it's not that important. For what seemed like 15 minutes, we were in a maelstrom, no visibility, and then suddenly it passed and we would live. This was about 3 p.m., and although there was cloud cover, of course, the ambient light was such that you could see 2 or so miles in any direction. If you're familiar with the sea, you know that such storms, particularly in shallow depths near land masses, dredge a lot of things from the sea floor. We were all on deck, working lines, checking equipment, checking damage, and the bay around us was choppy and churning and foaming. Older sailors often use the saying, "the sea is confused" when it gets like this. I looked about 15 feet on the starboard side, and something swam to the surface, broke it, looked at us, and then submerged. It was like a thin man with humanoid shape, arms articulated like a man. It had a small human head, but its skin was covered in scales like a snake. It looked at us, blinked its weird, heavy-lidded eyes, and then dove back under the foaming water. You need to know a few things about me at that moment. No drugs, no alcohol, no injuries. I was happy to just be alive and got through that. But my senses in that situation were sharpened, not dulled. At that time, I had about 6 years of experience on ships and fishing boats, and had seen squid, octopi, flying fish, sharks, skates, you name it, and I've seen them all around the world. I'm not the type of guy to see a patch of seaweed and call it a sea monster. I made an instant decision that I was not going to say anything about it. I mean, what could I say? I just saw a strange creature. Take my word for it? Yeah, the men on that boat were all mechanics and engineers and professionals. Why get a reputation as a flake? At the time, it was important for each of us to get D skipper or OOD qualifications, and saying something like that would be frowned upon. As I stood there in my life vest, soaking wet, hooked into the steel lifeline, glad to be alive, one of the other sailors, a USN captain with over 30 years' experience in the surface Navy, piped up and said, "I just saw a brown thing pop up on the surface. This sounds weird, but it looked like a lizard man with a scaly face, and it blinked at us with these big eyes, and then it went back under." "Yeah, I saw it too," I said. Apparently no one else had seen it, just the two of us. So we sailed back to the pier later that day and never spoke of it again. Houseboat Horror, submitted by Adam. Here's a scary boating story that happened to me and my friends when we rented a houseboat in Pennsylvania. We were all a couple of years out of college, and we wanted to get together for something to do in the summer of 2008. It was me, I'll say my name is Adam for this story, Jeff and Phil, who were twin brothers. We were all going to rent this big houseboat for the week with our girlfriends and just cruise up and down the lake and have a good time. Also with us were my girlfriend at the time, I'll call her Tara, Phil's woman and his now wife, Marie, and Jeff was dating a woman named Michelle. It was mid-July when we all met at my parents' house and drove to the marina, and holy shit, if you've never been on one of these things, I really recommend it. But the start of our trip was a little bit rocky to say the least, and that's what this story's about. The boat was about 50 feet long, had a full kitchen, 3 berths, full bath, and a slide from the roof, and even a hot tub up there. We would literally just go anywhere we wanted, moor the boat, and get our party on. The The weather was looking good, so we loaded up the food and tons of beer, wine, and booze. We had poker chips, Phil brought his PlayStation, and man, we knew we were in for a good time. I pulled out of the marina slip and carefully started cruising down the lake. Getting the hang of driving these things takes a bit, but mainly because it's just so big. Once we were away from land, I grabbed a Yingling from the fridge and just tooled around as the others set up the bedrooms and got ready to sunbathe on the deck. Jeff came over to me while the others were outside, and he'd already gotten into a fight with Michelle. They were known for their epic fights, and I told him to grab a beer and just relax. I was hoping the whole week wasn't going to be like that, but I would be proven wrong, and Michelle did cause some things to go wrong. We stopped in a little bay area for the day about an hour later as the weather took a turn for the worse and it started raining a bit. We didn't care. We sat on the front of the boat under the covered area drinking and talking and such, and Jeff and Michelle were back to being cool, and despite the clouds and sprinkles, it was a blast. Phil fired up the grill and Tara helped make some hot dogs as we talked about going to this place called the Cliffs the next day. You can climb up them and jump off into the water, and we were just pumped to be spending our time together. We all got pretty sauced and fell asleep in various parts of the boat after we went inside. I woke up and went into the kitchen to get a bottle of water and flicked on the lights. And I thought I heard someone on the roof, and thought maybe, it's Jeff or Phil, but then I saw Jeff lying on the couch. I heard another thump, and then went back to the sleeping quarters, peeked in on Tara, and looked downstairs to see the legs of Phil, Michelle, and Marie. Who the hell was up there? I went back into the kitchen, turned off the lights, and went over to Jeff and poked him. "What the fuck are you doing?" he asked me loudly, and I gave him the shut up and listen gesture and pointed to the ceiling. There were more footsteps, but they were sneaky footsteps, like whoever it was working hard to not be heard. Jeff went to the door and quietly opened it, and we listened. Nothing was going on. I went inside and heard the footsteps moving to the back of the boat, and remembered that my bedroom led to the back deck. I ran back just in time to see a naked figure staring in at Tara with his hands up to the window trying to get a better look. I yelled, and the guy, it was a guy, jumped a bit and then turned and threw himself into the water. A second later, I heard another splash as somebody else jumped in. By the time I got out to the deck, both guys had vanished, but I could hear them swimming away. Everyone was now up after me yelling and wanted to know what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and searched around the boat, and Jeff went up on the roof with another light, but we didn't see anything. The girls were totally freaked out, and honestly, so was I. I really didn't want to move the boat in the dark, and I didn't know what to do, and Tara finally calmed me down, and Phil said he'd stay up and stay on guard if anyone came back. I was keyed up at this point and said, "Fuck it, I'll stay up, everyone else go back to bed." But Tara did stay up with me in the living room. She didn't want to be alone in bed. I grabbed a couple of beers and started playing Grand Theft Auto while Tara curled up on the couch next to me. Nothing else major happened that night, but I did hear some tapping outside the boat, and when I went to the window, it was just small waves hitting the side of it, so I thought, man, I've got to stop being paranoid. Eventually, I fell asleep around 4 and slept for a few hours. The next day, the girls made breakfast, and Jeff and I got the boat moving. Phil was looking at a map and told me how to get to the cliffs, and that it looked like a little farther up, and there was another cove that would be a great spot to stop for the evening after we were done there. It didn't take long to get there, and Phil threw in the anchor, and we swam over to the cliffs to brave the jump. Only Michelle came with us, as Marie and Tara said they were no way doing that. They wanted to lay in the sun and, quote, watch us morons. There were a bunch of other people there, and I guess there was a campground nearby, and it was a popular place. Other boats showed up, and it was actually kind of fun jumping into the water, and we met some cool people. Michelle and Jeff got into it again, and while we were still jumping and swimming, I noticed she was talking to a couple of other guys our age. Jeff saw it too, and when I said, "Man, should we go over there?" he said, "Nope, fuck her." I went over anyway and said hi to the guys who said their names were Randy and Carl. I'm using those names, but I have no idea if they were their real names. That's just what they said. They seemed pretty cool, and they said they were staying at the campground, and it was cool to see us, as most of the people at the campground were families. Michelle was being a little flirty, if you asked me, but I figured, hey, it's not my business, so I stayed out of it. Eventually, we got tired of the cliffs and went back to the boat, after going to get Michelle, who was still talking to the guys. This is important to what happened later. Jeff was pretty pissed, but I told him to let it go, and if he actually cared, he would have gone over to her and fixed the problem. He just went to his room and sulked while Phil and I got the boat over to another bay called the Old Cliffs, and we moored there for the rest of the day and what we thought would be the night. The beer and wine was flowing, and Tara kept hinting to me that we should go do some reading in our room. Yeah, reading. We fooled around, and I look back at that now and think, how tacky was that, having sex with our friends just a couple of feet away? Oh well, we were young and it was fun. We made dinner on the grill again, and as it got dark, Jeff and Michelle disappeared for a little slap and tickle as they had made up. The rest of us were on the roof in the hot tub talking and laughing when we heard Michelle scream and Jeff yell, "Who the fuck are you?" Phil and I immediately jumped up and ran to the ladder to see what was going on. It was about 10 o'clock and obviously dark. Phil yelled to Jeff asking what was up, and Jeff said when the two of them came out of their berth and into the living room, there was a guy in the front of the boat near the grill, but he jumped over the side when he saw them. Was this the same guy from the night before? I didn't care. I immediately went to the wheel, told Jeff to pull anchor, and that we were getting the fuck out of there. There was some chirping from the girls on the roof as I fired things up and started motoring away from the bay, but there was no way I was staying there. I drove across the water and up a ways to another spot before stopping. Everyone gathered in the living area and was pretty freaked out. Jeff had already called the sheriff to let them know this happened twice and where we were. They said to call back if it happened again, and things settled down once again, and we had a few more drinks to calm down even further. We made sure all the doors and stuff were locked before we went to our rooms for the night. About 2 a.m, I woke up to movement on the roof again. I waited for my eyes to adjust to the dark and saw a figure coming down the ladder. It was a naked guy. Randy, to be exact. He had a hunting knife in his hand, and as I got up, I actually stumbled backwards, as I hadn't even seen Carl, who was right at the door, naked, a knife in one hand and his dick in the other. This psycho was jerking off onto the glass, watching me and Tara lay in bed. Our eyes met each other, and I couldn't even muster a shout. He looked beyond crazy, and did what happens when you punch the clown. It went all over the glass, and he tapped the knife on the glass with the sickest grin I have ever seen. I reached for Tara, and by now Randy was standing next to Carl, and he actually ran his knife in hand through the stuff on the glass. They both backed up, and Carl put his finger up to his lips doing the shh motion, and then waved his finger at me going, "No, no, no." I stood there dumbfounded, and they simply went to the railing and jumped into the water and disappeared into the blackness. Tara was now awake, and I finally said, "Oh, fuck. What the fuck?" She asked what happened, and I pointed to the glass, not knowing how to tell her what I just saw. I finally did, and she screamed out, which woke everybody else up. We called the sheriff again, and this time they told us to stay put, and they came out to us in a launch. I told them everything that had been happening, and that's when we found out that, number one, the cops were pretty aware of these guys. They were known for this shit like this and weren't camping. They lived out there. 2, they had likely followed us from the marina on day 1. And 3, Michelle had told them where we were staying off the old cliffs. Thanks, Michelle. We filed a full report, and the debate was on as to whether or not we should just go home. I manned up, cleaned up the stuff off the glass after the sheriffs took a swab of it and looked for fingerprints. Despite all that crazy shit, we voted to stay, but I drove the boat much farther away, and the rest of the week was good with nothing bad happening. Man, I'll tell you what, there are some messed up people out there, and while no one got hurt and those freaks didn't attack us, they could have. If you're willing to sneak onto a boat and beat off in front of a guy while staring at his girlfriend with a knife in your hand, I think you're pretty much capable of anything. Blast off. I was fishing in a 17-foot Mohawk canoe off the main bridge in Titusville, Florida. This was around 2000. That area is teeming with fish, and I headed for a trough that NASA cut out to build the fuel railroad system out to the launch area. This spot holds black drum as well as other tasties. I had a trolling motor on the side of the canoe, and I headed down for my spot on the south shore. Over to my left, just as I arrived at the south end of the trough, I saw a pod of manatee in the water about 75 yards away. I had a little camera stowed away, and I decided to get some up-close pics for my kids. I turned west into the middle of the lagoon area and headed over to shallow water and grass beds with my trolling motor turned up to 5, which was top speed. I noticed it appeared very shallow immediately ahead of me, so I cut the motor to 0. That's the last thing I remember before I heard the loudest noise I ever heard, and it came from all around me. The water exploded around and under my 75-pound canoe with my 105-pound body in the back. The front of my canoe went up at a 45-degree angle, and the rear of my canoe with me in it came off the surface of the water with such an amount that my battery came off the floor. In the front of my canoe, all my tackle and such was launched into the air, and I remember seeing a single large pinfish arcing over the whole mess as I gripped the gunnels. It wasn't obvious what happened to me for a minute, and I was so shaken up that I was vulnerable and unsure if it would happen again. So I reattached things back to my trolling motor, the wires had come loose, I guess, and I went to the shoreline where the railroad actually passed by. I got out and tried to piece my equipment back together. The pod of roughly 21 manatees had come into the lagoon area recently, and as it turns out, they have a similar danger signal as beavers. They slap the surface of the water. They were really frightened by my entry into the area, and when that many do that and slap the water and it's in 2 feet of water, it can almost violate the laws of bowel physics. Trust me, I know. I was safe, but that was scary. Frostbite Regatta by Finally Retired. One of my own scary experiences was a 2-day frostbite regatta on the Chesapeake in wind and rain and water and air temps both in the mid-50s. My crew was beginning to show symptoms of hypothermia, so when we returned to the dock, I sent everyone home to warm up while I stayed behind. I was left as the only person at the marina, and I was a bit hypothermic myself, so I wasn't thinking straight. Our vessel was a 25-foot trailerable sailboat, but I was too tired to pull it out, so I went to tie it up to a mooring ball a couple of 100 yards offshore, pulling my hard dinghy along. I secured everything, including the swimming ladder and life jackets, stepped into the dinghy, lost my balance, and into the water I went. The wind and current quickly took the dinghy away, and I couldn't manage the 5-foot freeboard to pull myself back on. But there was a line hanging from the stern, which I tried to use to pull myself back in a couple of times before slipping and going underwater. By this time, I lost feeling in my hands and could no longer manage any more. I knew I could not swim to shore in these conditions, so I tied myself off as tightly as possible to that line, got into a fetal position, and waited for rescue while periodically yelling out. Long story short, someone eventually saw me from shore and called 911, and I got rescued by DNR after being in the water for maybe 30 minutes. My core temp was 94, and honestly, another 10 minutes in that water, I would have died from hypothermia. When I was taken to shore, I had no idea about my condition, so I refused to go to the fire station to be warmed up. I told them I was going to get in my car and drive home. I'd stood up and my legs crumbled underneath me, and the next thing I knew, I was wrapped in blankets inside the fire station. Obvious lesson. Always wear a life jacket. Now I wear one whenever I'm on a dock before I even get into a boat, and I don't take it off until I'm off the dock. Another lesson, correctly applied. Never try to swim in cold water. The water passing your body robs you of body heat, and hypothermia sets in quickly. Nearly half of anyone who tries to swim 50 yards or more in 50-degree water dies of hypothermia. Oh, did I say we came in second in the regatta? 5 seconds off of first. What Happened Out There by Noble. I was once canoeing the boundary waters between Minnesota and Canada. These aren't your normal backyard ponds. The boundary waters are thousands of enormous lakes interconnected with each other. Think like mini Great Lakes. We had been canoeing and camping along the lakes for about a week at this point. We didn't really have an itinerary, just planned to boat and camp, fish, and live off the land for 2 weeks. We had a GPS and a satellite phone to call for a helicopter for pickup if we were ever in trouble. Anyway, about a week in, we were set to canoe a few hours to the next lake, and an hour or so in, we were in the center of an extremely long and narrow lake. Unfortunately, a storm started to blow in, and the waves on the lake swelled over 2 feet, and too much for our dinky canoes. We pulled off to a random clearing on the shore and set up camp quickly to avoid being totally thrashed by the rainstorm. We just set up camp and then hunkered down for the night. By the next morning it had cleared up, and we started walking up the coast of the lake about 200 feet from our camp looking for a good fishing spot. What we actually found was another campsite. It was absolutely wrecked. Trash strewn everywhere, tents collapsed and torn, clothes on the ground, and at first we were just disgusted, what assholes did this or left their shit out here to be bear food? The more we looked around, though, the weirder things seemed to be. For one, their garbage was still hoisted into a tree to keep it safe from bears, but the whole bag was ripped open despite being 30 feet in the air. Second, literally everything except the canoes were still at the campsite. Clothes, packs, food, rope, pans, a serious set of hiking equipment, enough for 2 or 3 people. And half of it was trashed and torn open, mostly the packs, tent, and clothes, but the other half was totally untouched, just thrown to the ground. Like someone noped the hell out of there and nothing but their long johns, ditching hundreds of dollars of gear in the process. We waited a couple of hours and eventually called it back to our helicopter crew, but they hadn't been aware of anybody else or gotten any distress calls. We eventually just left everything and moved camp. Everybody was pretty upset by it, and a day or 2 later we ended the whole trip early because it just seemed like no one wanted to be out there anymore. It was the weirdest thing I'd ever seen. First thought was bear attack, but it was food left uneaten. And I've seen bear attacks on camps before, and it was nothing like this. Bears usually just rip open packs and go after food, and they're generally pretty easy to scare away. What still sticks with me is why all their clothes and packs were still there, with half being totally destroyed and the other half not being touched. I still don't get it. I've done a lot of other camping and hiking, rafting and biking, all around the country, and I've never had any other weird experiences like that.